They thought it was just a lavender bush. But when the HOA started trimming it without permission, they didn't know they were trespassing on grief, legacy, and law. I didn't yell, I didn't fight, I built a beehive. Now the bush they tried to destroy is state protected, and the HOA running scared. This isn't just a garden, it's a trap they walked into. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. I didn't move to Lavender Hill for the nightlife, or the proximity to downtown, or even the schools, which were, admittedly, excellent. I moved here for the silence. There's a certain hush that falls over the cul-de-sac around 6:45 a.m., when the sun is just peeking between the two cottonwood trees at the end of the block, and the robins are still brave enough to sing without interruption. That was the moment I lived for. That first breath of morning air, laced with dew and the soft, subtle perfume of my lavender bush. It wasn't just a plant to me. It was ritual. Therapy. I planted it 3 springs ago, shortly after losing my husband, Michael. He was a quiet man too, an environmental science teacher who could identify bees by their wing patterns and believed that people underestimated the emotional intelligence of plants. He used to say that lavender could soothe even the most haunted of hearts. I wasn't sure I believed him then. I do now. After he passed, I stopped sleeping through the night. I stopped cooking real meals. But what I didn't stop was walking outside each morning, barefoot, coffee in hand, and brushing my fingers along that soft, purple line of blossoms. I'd inhale, pause, and in that single inhale, I could almost feel him standing next to me, telling me things would be okay. So yes, the lavender bush wasn't just flora, it was memory, grief, and healing, which is why the first time I saw the missing stems, I assumed the worst of myself. Maybe I'd brushed too hard. Maybe deer had come through in the night. Maybe I was imagining things. I trimmed the edges with a practiced eye and shrugged it off. No harm done. But then, 3 days later, more was gone. A full section of bloom, cut straight across like it had been manicured with hedge trimmers. The kind of cut that's mechanical, not natural. Too clean to be wind, too purposeful to be animal. That's when the pit formed in my stomach. It was a strange feeling, like having someone rearrange a photo on your nightstand, or move your coffee mug an inch to the left. Subtle, invasive, unsettling. At first I thought it might have been the neighborhood kids. We had a few that skateboarded by every afternoon, always polite, but curious. Maybe they'd been dared to grab a handful for a prank. I even laughed myself at the thought. Kids and flowers. Harmless, right? Then came the note. No envelope, just a slip of paper folded on my front porch mat like some unwanted calling card. It was typed in Times New Roman formal. Sterile. The kind of font that strips all humanity from the words. Dear resident, your front yard plantings are exceeding the acceptable height per HOA guidelines, Section 4, Article C. Please address this immediately to maintain neighborhood harmony. Lavender Hill, HOA Landscaping Committee. No signature, no greeting, no kindness. I stood there on my porch, reading that short note over and over, trying to understand how my therapy had suddenly become someone else's problem. Too tall? The bush barely reached my knee. It didn't obstruct any sidewalk, didn't spill into anyone else's property. But it did bloom brightly, boldly. It was alive. That night, I sat on my front steps with a flashlight and scanned every edge of the lavender bush, trying to make sense of what was happening. I found more trimmed ends. Clean, uniform, cold. And that was when something in me shifted. It wasn't just the plant they were pruning. It was my autonomy, my space, my grief. And something told me this wasn't going to be the last time I found a part of it missing. 3 days after the unsigned note, I decided to go straight to the source. Lavender Hills HOA met on the first Thursday of every month at 7 a.m. in the community clubhouse. A beige stucco building with an overgrown rhododendron out front, and ironically, a crack running down the concrete walkway. They didn't seem particularly concerned about curb appeal when it was their own. Inside, there was the usual spread: lukewarm coffee, a tray of cookies that looked like they'd come from a gas station, and a whiteboard with a smiley face doodled in the corner, as if that made up for what these meetings really were. Quiet little power rituals. I signed the clipboard at the entrance and took a seat near the back, lavender clippings tucked neatly into a Ziploc bag in my purse. I wasn't here to start a war. I was here to ask why. They moved through the budget, a complaint about someone's boat parked in a driveway, and a brief tangent about repainting the tennis court lines. Then, near the end, came landscaping notes. That's when I raised my hand. Yes. The board president, Mark, glanced over his glasses at me. I received a note about my lavender bush. It said it was violating HOA standards. I'd like to know which standard specifically. A pause. Then, Dana spoke up. She was the landscaping chair. A woman with helmet blonde hair, a red leather binder clutched like a badge of honor, and a voice like someone who always thought she was being interrupted. It's in the handbook, she said with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. Section 4, Article C, Uniformity and Visual Cohesion. Your bush is unruly. Unruly? I repeated, arching an eyebrow. It's planted, pruned, and doesn't exceed 2 feet in height. She shrugged. It's not about height. It's about presentation. Could I see the actual policy? At that, Mark looked vaguely uncomfortable and began rifling through a manila folder. Dana, however, didn't flinch. You don't need to see the policy, it's standard. Your yard needs to reflect the agreed-upon aesthetic of the neighborhood. Your lavender draws attention. Isn't that the point of flowers? I asked, keeping my tone level. To draw attention? Why is that a violation? Dana let out a soft, condescending laugh. It's just a bush, sweetheart. There it was. That tone. That word. I felt my fingers curl slightly around the edges of my purse. I could feel the plastic Ziploc crackle beneath my palm. Not to me, I said quietly. She tilted her head. You're taking this personally. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Every person in that room could hear it. The razor edge beneath her smile. The sugar-coated tyranny dressed in polite policy. But no one said a word. They rarely did. I left without a scene. No yelling, no threats. Just silence. But that silence wasn't surrender. A week later, more was gone. This time, not just a few sprigs or a section of bloom, it looked like someone had taken an electric trimmer to the center of the bush, shearing it open like a wound. Blossoms lay scattered on the grass like confetti after a funeral. I knelt beside it and examined the cuts. Clean, angled, mechanical. Deliberate. There were no tire marks, no footprints, just absence. That night, I filed a formal complaint to the HOA, requesting an investigation into unauthorized landscaping activity on private property. I sent it certified mail. I copied every board member. I included photos and timestamps. 2 days later, I received another note on my doorstep. Not mailed, not typed. This one was handwritten in perfect, looping cursive on embossed HOA stationery. We understand your emotional attachment to your lavender bush. However, your landscaping remains inconsistent with the standards of Lavender Hill. Please take appropriate action before further steps are required. Dana Holloway, landscaping chair. No signature this time. Just her name. Cold as a chisel. I stared at it for a long time. Not because it surprised me, but because of what it revealed. They weren't hiding anymore. Dana had claimed authorship. She'd put herself forward as the face of this silent aggression. And she thought I wouldn't push back. She thought I'd back down because that's what people like her expected from people like me. Widowed, quiet, alone. They thought I was soft. But there's something they never understood about lavender. You can trample it, shear it, even burn it, but it comes back stronger every time. And I was done being quiet. When you live alone long enough, you develop a sixth sense for when something is off. The second time I found a fresh cut in my lavender bush after speaking with the HOA, I knew the damage wasn't random. The third time, I stopped guessing. I started watching. I didn't want to confront them, not yet. I wanted proof, and I knew the kind of people I was dealing with. They were the type who smiled while holding a knife behind their back, or in this case, garden shear. So I got creative. Michael and I used to birdwatch on weekends. We built wooden feeders and painted them with water-based varnish to be bee-safe. One of our last projects had been a decorative birdhouse. Hollow, charming, with a pitched roof and a weathered finish. It still sat on the edge of the porch, unused. I hollowed out the base, drilled a tiny hole in the front, no bigger than a pencil eraser, and mounted a motion-activated trail camera inside. Thermal, night vision, time-stamped. Discreet. Legal. It pointed straight at the lavender bush. Then I waited. The footage came in quietly, like small drops into a bucket. Nothing the first night. Nothing the second. But on the third, at exactly 5:12 a.m., the motion sensor kicked in. There they were. Two shadows, slipping through the early dawn mist like burglars with pruning shears. Both wore black hoodies, one carrying a small flashlight angled downward, the other holding clippers. They didn't speak at first, only exchanged glances as they approached the lavender. Then the cutting began, methodical, quick, not trimming, harvesting. Like they had a quota. The camera caught everything: leaves falling, blossoms snapped, the click of metal against stem. It even caught the glint of a key fob clipped to one of their belts. But then, a voice. "We've got 4 more to do this week. Dana wants everything along Evergreen Lane under 6 inches by Sunday." A rustling sound. The flashlight flicked toward the ground. "Didn't she file that under Project Reclaim?" "Yeah, that's what she's calling it now. Makes it sound official, like we're doing public service." A pause. Laughter. "I swear, this lady and her lavender, she's gonna blow her top." The other one snorted. "She already filed a complaint. But Dana says as long as we keep it off record, we're fine. It's compliance through community action, not paperwork. Compliance through community action." I replayed that phrase 3 times. Then I downloaded the clip and backed it up in 3 places. I didn't sleep that night. Not out of fear, out of clarity. This wasn't just about my bush. This was organized, systematic, planned. The next morning, I opened the HOA portal and started digging. Meeting minutes. Landscaping notes. Archived newsletter. There it was, buried in a March newsletter under Neighborhood Beautification. "Thanks to our volunteer compliance partners for their help with Project Reclaim. Your efforts in promoting neighborhood harmony do not go unnoticed." There were no names, no formal policy entry, just an offhand nod to covert pruning missions being carried out by residents on other people's property. Under volunteers, I recognized 2 names that matched my early morning intruders: Jason and Derek. Both were landscape liaisons on the committee. Neither of them lived on my street. My stomach turned. This was vigilantism with pruning shears. A shadow HOA operation dressed up in the language of neighborhood harmony. Dana hadn't just condoned it, she'd orchestrated it, weaponized politeness, mobilized obedience. And my bush was just the beginning. I sat back watching the clip again in the dim light of my living room, the lavender bush dimly lit by the flashlight beam, the whispered voices of self-righteous suburban soldiers cutting through the quiet. That's when the shift happened. I had tried reasoning. I had asked for documentation. I had played by the rules. But they weren't using rules. They were using shadows. And I had just flipped on the floodlight. There's something cathartic about reaching the end of your patience. Not the dramatic kind. The shouting, stomping, storming out kind. No, I mean the quiet kind. The deciding kind. The kind where your voice doesn't tremble anymore, because you're no longer asking for permission. That's the kind of calm that filled me the morning after I watched those 2 HOA volunteers trespass on my lawn for the 2nd time in a week. I poured my coffee, sat on the porch, and looked out at the mangled remains of my lavender bush. And then I smiled. Because they had no idea who they were dealing with. What Dana and her landscaping henchmen didn't know, and had clearly never bothered to ask, was that before I moved here, before I was a grieving widow with a grief-tinged garden, I had been a partner in a pollinator sanctuary. Michael and I co-founded it on a patch of leased farmland just outside Boulder. It was his dream, an organic, sustainable haven for native bee species. He handled the apiary side, and I handled education, legal compliance, community outreach. We built it from the ground up: soil, permits, licensing. After his diagnosis, when the sanctuary became too much to maintain, we shut it down, but my certifications never expired. I still held a state-issued license for small-scale pollination operations, still had a permit from the Department of Agriculture to maintain registered hives for ecological and educational purposes, still had documentation that would make any petty HOA landscaping clause look like tissue paper in a ring. Even more conveniently, I had taken an environmental law course through the community college the year after Michael passed. Mostly to feel connected to him, but also to understand the rights I still had. So yes, I knew the law. I knew my permits. And now, I had motive. They wanted to treat my garden like a battleground. Fine. Let me introduce them to my army. I spent that afternoon combing through old boxes in the garage until I found what I was looking for. Michael's final hive box. Untouched. Still sturdy. Compact enough to go unnoticed, unless you were looking for it. I cleaned it thoroughly, reinforced the foundation, and discreetly built it into the base of a decorative planter, lavender-friendly, but now humming with far more potential. Then I made a few calls. 2 weeks later, I received a small, secure shipment of carnelian bees from a reputable apiary sire. Gentle by nature, good for suburban pollination, and known for thriving in lavender. I introduced them gradually, letting them acclimate. They adapted fast. Within days, the hive was active, healthy, balanced, protective. To the casual eye, my bush was just regrowing. To the informed, it was now a registered, protected pollinator habitat. And I hung the tiny state-issued sign right beside it. Legally required, legally sufficient, legally untouchable. Let's just say, I dared them to come near it now. But this wasn't just about defense. This was about honoring legacy. Michael used to say that bees were nature's quiet enforcers, small, unnoticed, often underestimated, but absolutely essential. You don't need to shout to change an ecosystem, he told me once. You just need the right swarm. So I gave Lavender Hill one. The best part, everything I was doing was entirely within my rights. My permits were current. My hive was below the HOA's nuisance threshold. I had logged everything with the state's environmental department. I even updated my homeowner's insurance to reflect the presence of the hive. Just in case. And if they did try to find me, harass me, or touch that bush again, well, the state's Pollinator Protection Act had teeth. Legal ones. For the first time since moving here, I felt like I wasn't just surviving. I was strategizing, fighting back. But not with pettiness or passive aggression, with precision, with truth, with legacy. And every time I heard the soft hum of those bees working inside their hidden home, I heard Michael's voice again, not in mourning, but in motion. Revenge doesn't always come in flames and fury. Sometimes it arrives in a whisper. Sometimes it hums. After installing the hive within the Lavender's new planter box, I monitored it closely. The bees settled faster than I expected, drawn to the familiar scent of the lavender blooms, working their way through each petal like they'd been waiting their whole lives to pollinate this one patch of ground. And maybe, in a way, they had. The planter looked like any decorative lawn feature. A ceramic base, slightly wider than the bush, weather-resistant and shaded by solar lights, but beneath that innocent exterior sat a thriving, low-maintenance nucleus of 30,000 carnelian bees. Calm, loyal, and fiercely protective. To the average neighbor walking by, it was just a plant reclaiming its bloom. To the HOA, it was now untouchable ground. The first thing I did was file a notification with the state's Department of Agriculture, logging the active hive as a registered pollinator habitat. This wasn't just some backyard experiment. This was legally recognized ecological infrastructure. Then came the signage. It was subtle, just a 4x6 placard staked neatly in front of the lavender. Soft green lettering on white with a small honeybee logo and official seal. Protected pollinator habitat. Do not disturb. Registered with the State Department of Agriculture. Nothing flashy, just official enough to make anyone pause. And sure enough, they paused. Dana passed by that same afternoon. I watched from behind the blinds as she slowed in front of my house, hands on hips, visor tilted forward like she was inspecting a crime scene. Her gaze dropped to the sign. She bent slightly, squinted, then stepped back. Her phone came out. She took a picture, 2 actually, then walked off without so much as glancing at the lavender itself. That was the first sign it was working. The second came the following morning. A new landscaping reminder email blast went out to the neighborhood, this time emphasizing that any independent landscaping adjustments made on another resident's property will be considered a breach of conduct and may result in fines or removal from committee service. They didn't name names, but they didn't need to. I had quietly forced their hand. And I hadn't said a word. The hive's growth was steady. I checked it twice a week, gloves on, Veil down, notes taken. My husband's old field journal sat open beside me on the porch, as I logged behavior patterns, bloom synchronization, and hive productivity. The entire garden had changed. The lavender bloomed fuller, more vibrant, the nearby rosemary, sage, and thyme thrived. Birds started returning, drawn by the gentle buzz of life, not disturbed by it. Even the kids on the block grew curious. One afternoon, little Maddie from next door tiptoed over with her mom and asked, in a whisper, if she could see the bee bush. I smiled and said yes, so long as she stayed on the path. We watched from a safe distance as a worker bee danced over a petal, and Maddie's eyes went wide with wonder. That was the moment I knew something deeper had shifted. This was no longer just retaliation, this was reclamation. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. I got a politely worded letter from the HOA 2 weeks later requesting clarification on whether my yard met HOA safety and aesthetics guidelines now that livestock had been introduced. Livestock. I replied with a scanned copy of my state apiary registration, a screenshot of the Pollinator Protection Act clause shielding registered hives from nuisance complaints, and a highlighted section from their own handbook that failed to mention bees even once. I ended the email with, "Let me know if you'd like to schedule a neighborhood bee education workshop. I've already had 3 parents express interest." I never heard back. By the 3rd week, the bush was flourishing again, lavender pouring out in soft, fragrant waves. The bees had transformed it into a living ecosystem. Dana, meanwhile, hadn't come near it since the day she took her photos. The irony, the very thing she tried to cut down had become too sacred to touch. Legally protected, ethically necessary, publicly admired, all without a single raised voice. No threats, no angry emails, just 30,000 quiet guests doing their job better than any board committee ever could. Michael would have loved it. He always believed that systems of power collapse under the weight of their own arrogance, that the smallest, quietest things in life can hold the greatest strength. And now, every time I sat on my porch and watched the lavender dance with bees, I knew that strength was mine. Not because I shouted, not because I fought dirty, but because I understood one simple truth. You don't need to bulldoze a system to defeat it. You just need to make it irrelevant. I knew she'd try again. People like Dana don't walk away. They regroup. They plan. They convince themselves they're right even when the entire neighborhood is standing in bloom against them. And true to form, it happened on a Thursday morning. I was inside steeping chamomile when I saw her. Red gardening gloves, oversized sunglasses, the kind of hat you wear to a horse race, not a garden raid. She strutted across my lawn like she owned the soil. I didn't move, just stepped quietly to the window and watched. She paused in front of the lavender, looked both ways like a cartoon villain, and reached for the bush. And that's when they met her. The bees weren't aggressive. They were trained defenders, docile, non-lethal. But like any good security system, they responded to threat proximity. She brushed too close to the hive's base, trying to grab a cluster of blossoms, and the air shifted with warning. A low hum rose like a chorus being tuned. Then the first sting. Dana yelped, flailed, stumbled back. Another sting. She spun, batting at the air, tripped over the decorative edging, and landed in the grass with all the grace of an unhinged raccoon. It was over in seconds. Just 2 stings, one on her wrist, the other on the side of her neck. Nothing serious. Nothing medically alarming. But ego, that was a different story. She stormed off, red-faced and muttering threats to no one in particular. I sat back down with my tea and smiled into the steam. That night, she brought the ward to the clubhouse. I hadn't planned to attend the HOA meeting that evening, but I showed up 10 minutes early, just in case. The room was already humming with gossip. Dana sat near the front, arm wrapped in an unnecessary compression bandage, flanked by 2 silent committee members, like she was preparing for trial. The landscaping chair nameplate glared in front of her like it knew better. Mark, the HOA president, began the meeting. He barely got through the agenda before Dana stood. "I have a formal complaint," she said, loud and tight. "Against resident," she looked down theatrically, "Miss Margaret Langley for hosting aggressive insects in violation of community safety standards and engaging in." She paused, eyes wide for effect. "The weaponization of nature." There was a beat of stunned silence. Someone coughed. I stood. May I respond? I asked calmly. Mark nodded, eyes wary. I reached into my leather tote and removed a slim folder, state permits, printed photos, and 3 signed letters from neighbors in support of the pollinator habitat. I handed them to Mark. I am a state-licensed beekeeper, I said clearly. My hive is registered with the Department of Agriculture. The lavender bush is part of a certified pollinator habitat, legally protected under both the Pollinator Protection Act and our own HOA charter, which until tonight has no clause forbidding non-aggressive native bee colonies. Dana tried to interrupt, but I raised one finger. Furthermore, I continued, I have security footage of unauthorized individuals, Dana included, repeatedly trespassing on my property and trimming the lavender bush without consent. Would you like me to share that now? Mark blinked. Dana's face turned a violent shade of beet. I was simply doing my duty as landscaping chair, she snapped. Your yard was non-compliant. I tilted my head. By whose written standard? Her mouth opened, closed. I turned back to the board. I followed the law. I followed your rules. I protected my space the right way. Meanwhile, I've been targeted, trespassed on, and ironically stung with fines for defending my legal rights. Dana lunged for her binder, flipping frantically through pages. I smiled gently. Would you like to explain to the room why you've been conducting unsanctioned landscaping projects on private property? Silence. Someone in the back whispered, she's got her. Mark cleared his throat. I think we need to table this for review, and I recommend a temporary suspension of Dana's landscaping authority while we investigate. There were murmurs of agreement. Even Dana's usual allies shifted in their seats. It wasn't loud, it wasn't explosive, but it was final. The sound of control slipping. The sound of a false authority cracking under its own arrogance. As I left the room, someone stopped me by the door. A younger couple who lived 2 houses down. Your yard's the nicest on the block, the woman said softly. Just so you know. I nodded, still holding my folder.
And the bees?
Her partner asked. They're kind of amazing. Nature takes care of its own, I said. You just have to give it the space. Some truths don't need to be shouted, they just need to be seen. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the last Thursday of the month, held in the community clubhouse, the same beige stucco box where Dana had once dismissed my lavender as unruly. But this time, I wasn't there to ask questions. I was on the agenda. I had requested 10 minutes. Mark, the HOA president, had reluctantly agreed, probably expecting a drawn-out complaint or a request for reimbursement. What he didn't know was that I wasn't coming with a story. I was bringing a show. I arrived early, not to mingle, but to prep. I brought my laptop, HDMI cable, and a small projector. The clubhouse wall was blank enough to serve as a screen. I had labeled the presentation, Pollinator Protection Overview, just vague enough to keep Dana from realizing what was coming. By 7:10 p.m. the room was full, folding chairs crammed with neighbors, reusable water bottles and laps, a few people scrolling their phones. Dana sat in the front row, pristine as ever, binder in hand, wrapped wrist still on display like a war wound. Mark called the meeting to order. Minutes were approved. Budgets discussed. Then came my name. I walked up slowly, nodded at the board, and connected the projector. I appreciate the time, I began. I just want to share a few things with you all. Nothing dramatic, just some footage. The first clip began to play. It was the night vision video. The trail camera's grainy green hue lit up the clubhouse wall like a ghost story. Gasps broke out almost immediately. There they were, Jason and Derek. Hoods up, clippers out, creeping across my lawn like middle-aged ninjas. The timestamp blinked 5:12 a.m. Dana's voice followed soon after, recorded just off camera from a previous clip. Don't worry, she's a widow. She won't fight. That's when the room shifted. The murmurs grew louder. Someone in the back said, "Wait, that's real." I paused the footage, turned to face the room. I filed 3 formal complaints, I said. I asked for documentation. I asked for transparency. Instead, my property was repeatedly trespassed on, vandalized, and targeted. I was dismissed. Diminished. Because of a lavender bush. I let the silence settle. This wasn't enforcement. This was surveillance disguised as service. An unapproved initiative, Project Reclaim, run without homeowner consent. You don't have to believe me. You just watched it. I clicked to the next slide. Permits. State license. EPIRI registration. A photo of my posted sign. A copy of Dana's handwritten warning letter, passive-aggressive ink looping across HOA stationery. Dana finally spoke. "This is completely out of context," she said, voice thin. "We were just trying to maintain neighborhood standards." "No," I said, cutting her off. Calmly, finally. "You were maintaining control." Mark cleared his throat. "Thank you, Margaret. We, appreciate your preparation." There was a pause, a long one. Then someone stood. It was Mr. Benton, retired, always quiet, whose wife tended the rose bushes on Alder Lane. "I'd like to motion that we suspend Dana from her position on the board. Effective immediately, pending further review." A second came from the back. Tasha, a young mom who had once told me her toddler liked the bees. Mark looked startled, but he nodded. "All in favor?" The hands went up, one by one. Then in clusters. Then Dana didn't speak again. They called a 5-minute recess after that, but it felt like the end of something. When we returned, Mark, suddenly more pliable, addressed the room. "There's been a suggestion," he said slowly, "to create a new compliance process. One that requires homeowner consent before any landscaping adjustments are made. Volunteer oversight, transparent documentation." There were nods. Agreement. And just like that, what started as a bush became a boundary. A symbol. As I packed up my things, several neighbors came up to shake my hand. Others offered quiet apologies, nothing dramatic, just the kind that matter most. I stepped out into the night air and looked toward my yard down the street. The lavender shimmered faintly under the street lamp. Bees tucked safely inside their hidden home. They had tried to clip me down. Instead, they pruned their own power. No letterhead, no board vote, just a fine, delivered like a threat. I didn't panic. I didn't even blink. Because what they didn't know was that the state already knew. 3 weeks earlier, right after I installed the hive and registered it, I'd sent a courtesy notice to State Apiary Board just to make them aware of the situation. It was a simple email, clear, professional, attached my permit, listed the location of the hive, included photos, and explained that I anticipated potential resistance from an HOA, unfamiliar with pollinator laws. Just a precaution. Just in case. Turns out, it was the smartest thing I'd done all month. 3 days after the fine appeared, a letter arrived at the HOA office. It was on official state letterhead, signed by a senior compliance officer from the Department of Agriculture. The subject line alone was enough to draw blood. Re-interference with registered apiary, violation of pollinator protection legislation. The letter was short, direct, beautiful. It reminded the HOA that my hive was registered, legal, and protected under State Environmental Code 14.6, which prohibits the unauthorized disruption, removal, or penalization of state-certified pollinator habitats. It further stated that any attempt to interfere with the hive, including punitive action against the property owner, could constitute a violation, subject to investigation, and fines up to 5. The letter closed with one final sentence I will never forget. "This department recommends the Lavender Hill Homeowners Association immediately rescind any pending action and consult environmental legal counsel before pursuing further action." In one paragraph, the state had done what I couldn't do in months. Put the HOA in its place. The fine disappeared 2 days later, quietly. No apology, no announcement. Just gone, like it had never existed. I printed the letter on ivory cardstock and framed it. Hung it right inside my front hallway, next to Michael's old beekeeper certification. People hang family crests in their entryways. I hung state supremacy over HOA tyranny. Not because I needed to brag, but because I needed to remember that the system can work when you know how to work it. That justice isn't always loud, but it can be official. And that sometimes, poetic justice comes with a government seal and a barcode in the corner. The lavender bloomed taller that week. I didn't touch it. I didn't have to. Nature was speaking for itself now. And this time, it had legal backup. It's strange how quickly things settle after the storm passes. Not with noise, not with grand declarations, but with quiet, rhythmic days. The kind where you don't brace for the next fight, you just breathe. And for the first time in a long time, I could breathe fully again. Spring turned to summer, and the lavender, my lavender, exploded into bloom. Deeper purple, fuller crowns, the kind of blossom that buzzes with life before you even step onto the grass. The hive thrived, healthy, balanced, calm. Every morning, the bees traced their familiar patterns through the air, weaving through sunlight and scent like little artisans of order. I didn't have to manage them much anymore. They knew what to do. Nature always does when left alone. The new HOA board was different. Dana resigned quietly 2 weeks after the state letter arrived. No announcement, no confrontation. One day her name was on the landscaping committee roster. The next day, it wasn't. A for sale sign went up in her yard, and 2 weekends later, it was gone. I never saw her pack, never saw a moving truck. She just disappeared. Fitting, really. She'd come in like a storm and left like smoke, loud, disruptive, but ultimately without roots. In her place, the board appointed Julia Tran, an environmental science teacher and backyard gardener who once stopped by to ask what kind of lavender I used. Julia introduced a new initiative, Neighbor Nurture Saturdays. Kids came to learn about native pollinators. Retirees volunteered to plant milkweed and wildflowers along the greenbelt. Even Mark, the former HOA president, showed up one weekend with a mason jar of iced tea and a box of seed bombs from his niece. I watched from my porch most days. Sometimes I joined, sometimes I just listened to the laughter, the soft hum of bees mixing with the sound of sneakers on pavement and garden tools in fresh soil. The same community that once judged my bush as too wild was now planting their own. Irony is a patient gardener. As for me, I never took down the sign. Protected pollinator habitat, do not disturb, still stands proudly in front of the lavender bed. Surrounded by flat river stones, the neighborhood kids painted with tiny bees, flowers and quotes they didn't quite understand, but somehow got right anyway. Let it grow. Be kind. Buzz like no one's watching. Michael would have loved that. I still keep his old field notebook on the porch table. The pages are worn now, sun-bleached at the corners, but the ink holds, so does the memory. Every time I see a child crouch down to watch a bee land gently on a bloom, I think of him. Every time a neighbor smiles at the lavender instead of sneering, I feel his presence, not in the past, but in the legacy. They tried to tame it. They tried to control what they didn't understand. But in the end, the bush they tried to prune became a sanctuary. Not just for me, but for an entire street learning to grow past control and into care. The lavender bloomed bigger than ever. And so did I. Ever faced rules that felt more like weapons? If you've ever been underestimated, outvoted, or overruled on your own lawn, this story was for you. We're just getting started exposing the quiet wars behind picket fences and garden gates. Because behind every HOA battle, there's a story they don't want you to hear. Stick around, your neighbor's secrets might be next.